Hello and welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. Many moons ago my wife bought me a copy of Dungeon Saga Dwarf King's Quest, and it was alright. I liked it well enough to keep it in my collection, but I had issues with the game that stopped me from being able to really engage with it and invest in repeated plays. Some of those issues were down to the physical components. Card text was too small, tiles too fiddly, quest maps too dark. But ultimately, it felt like it had been created to fill the void that HeroQuest had left in the market, and it was almost trying too hard to fix HeroQuest by implementing mechanisms to address every possible imperfection in the granddaddy of dungeon crawlers. Dungeon Saga removed roll and move, replaced custom dice with good old regular d6, introduced more tactics during combat, gave the dungeon master more things to do, added skills and special abilities, and often employed a brutal timer mechanism that meant every dungeon delve was more like a sprint than an exploration. And the more it tried to be HeroQuest but better, the more I felt it could never really come out from HeroQuest Shadow to truly be its own thing. And the more I felt it was starting to become too unrefined and messy for what should have been a very simple entry-level crawler. So, I had a bit of fun with the game, but ended up mainly using my copy for the components for use in Dungeons & Dragons and other dungeon plunging games. But I never thought it was a bad game, and there were some aspects I thought were brilliant. The dice combat in particular is really interesting. That being the case, when I heard that Mantic Games were doing a Kickstarter for a revised Streamlined edition of the game called Dungeon Saga Origins, I knew that while I wasn't going to back it, I was going to keep an eye on it at retail. Fast forward to May 2024, and Mantic Games reached out to me to ask if I was interested in reviewing the brand new retail edition of the core game. Of course, I was, and today we are going to unbox and review Dungeon Saga Origins and see whether it might be the right dungeon crawler for you. Before we really drill into it though, I just wanted to briefly discuss the box. The first thing that really caught my eye was the design of the cover art, which is a really lovely homage to the red box edition of the D&D basic rules. I thought that was a nice touch. The second thing was the size of the box. In a world where board games in general, and particularly thematic adventure board games, seem to be getting larger and larger, not to mention more expensive, Mantic Games have created a core set that can easily fit on a retailer's shelf, won't cost a fortune to ship, and can be picked up for around £50 online. Despite that, there is a decent amount of game packed in here. It's amazing how much Mantic managed to do with such a limited amount of components. For example, there are only 3 map tiles, but they are double-sided and cleverly designed to fit together in any orientation. As you can use them with the edges flush or staggered, there are a lot of configurations, helping each dungeon feel like somewhere new. As another example, consider there are only 18 enemy miniatures in the box, comprising 7 regular foes and 2 bosses. At first glance, with all of the enemies being undead, the variety seems lacking. However, Mantic have tried to make the enemies feel different. Zombies will group together to benefit from their mob tactics, brittle skeleton archers will hang back to ping their foes at range, skeletons can reroll missed strikes, ghosts drift through walls and furniture to strike unwary heroes, undead dwarves are tough little tanks, and the trolls are huge lumbering brutes that fill 4 squares on the board. Then you have the heroes. You only get 4, but they each have their own special skill, certain types of equipment they can and can't use, and they can each be customized by selecting one of 2 different feats, which are effectively single-use superpowers. The wizard also gets to pick 2 sets of spells from a choice of 3. It isn't much, but it's enough to make each hero feel different and to give some options right out of the gate for how you would like to play them. And while the game does support one-off dungeon plunges, it also has a full campaign system, where you play through the 10 included scenarios in sequence, accumulating experience points and buying equipment. At first, it really doesn't look that there are enough upgrades to sustain a campaign like that. There are only 15 purchasable items, for example, but Mantic got around that in a variety of ways. Potions drawn from the exploration deck while searching are lost at the end of the current adventure if they aren't used, just like in the good old classic European rules for HeroQuest. And while gold can be spent between adventures, that gold isn't easy to come by, and merchants only have a limited selection of randomly drawn items for sale each time. Furthermore, the experience heroes accumulate through their trials is fleeting. After each quest, heroes that didn't get taken out of commission will gain some experience points, and those can be cashed in for boons. These boons are very powerful abilities, but they can only be used once and are then discarded. Use all your boons, and your hero effectively ends up back at square one. What this all means is that while it is possible to develop a character over numerous gaming sessions, that character will never become so powerful they can steamroll any dungeon. There is always a reason to keep adventuring, and you never need to retire a hero who has become too powerful. Overall, I was very impressed how much game Mantic squeezed out of this core set, and I imagine anybody picking up a Legendary edition of the game should be really spoiled when it comes to gameplay and replayability. But, you knew there was a but, right? As impressed as I am with how much Mantic managed to do with so little, it's still hard not to feel like every corner was cut in some way, leaving what could have been a perfect, well-rounded introductory dungeon crawler with some fairly rough edges. And that is frustrating, because most of the ensuing issues are relatively easy to resolve. Map tiles are beautiful, but art assets are repeated on them, even within the same room. It is jarring to see these same shield or skeletal remains over and over again. The boards are also tiny, spaces are barely big enough for the miniatures, and the tokens for doors and treasure chests are minuscule. The box itself is big enough that the maps could have been a half-inch longer and wider, giving everything that little bit more room to breathe. There are only 5 legendary items to find throughout the campaign. That's just 5 magical items across 10 missions. And the equipment deck, despite only including 15 cards, has duplicate items. 2 shields, 2 pieces of armour, 2 helmets. This is annoying because it means you have less options when you are shopping. But also, Mantic made the unusual choice of using different images for functionally identical items. That's just confusing. Images should work as shortcuts, visual reminders of what an item does. In most circumstances, I don't think you should use the same image for 2 different items, and I don't think you should use different images for 2 items that are the same. Moving on, experience points and money tokens are ridiculously small and fiddly. I don't even bother trying to use them. And the boons purchasable with experience points are just little round tokens with icons on them, so you have to refer to the rules book to remind yourself what each one does. Why couldn't there have been a deck of boon cards so you had instant access to the rules as you played? So yeah, just one more punch board to allow for bigger tokens, a few more cards for boons, a couple of extra pieces of equipment, increasing the board size by half an inch, all little things that would have made a huge difference, and crucially, wouldn't have required an increase in the box size or a landslide of additional components. But gameplay is the Dwarf king, so if the game is amazing, any failures in components can be forgiven. So let's talk about gameplay. Dungeon Saga Origins is absolutely designed to be an accessible game suitable for a younger crowd. It's the sort of game that takes only minutes to learn, and it does sit so squarely in HeroQuest's wheelhouse, it's almost impossible to review it without mentioning HeroQuest in the process. We will get to that. But first let's consider Dungeon Saga Origins on its own merits. In a normal game, one player will take on the role of the Overlord, this game's version of a Dungeon Master, with up to 4 other players taking on the role of heroes. There is no scaling for using less than 4 heroes, much like HeroQuest. Damn it, that didn't last long. Much like in some other dungeon crawlers, if you play with less heroes, you just have to be prepared for a tougher journey. As characters are pretty simple, it's easy enough to control more than one, and that is generally the best option. And the characters are a traditional bunch. An elf archer, a dwarf warrior, a barbarian, and a wizard. Where do they get these wild ideas? The heroes each get a character card with all their stats and special rules, and while I think these have a nice modern aesthetic and clear design, the icons for the stats are horrible. The first one is a boot, indicating the number of spaces the hero can move when activated. That's fine. But that second icon, that's supposed to be 2 crossed axes, indicating how many dice the hero rolls in melee. The third symbol, believe it or not, is supposed to be 2 arrowheads, and indicates the number of dice the hero rolls for ranged attacks. The final icon is a shield, indicating the hero's starting armor class. For a game that has a generally very slick design and aesthetic, I think these icons needed just a little bit more work. Each hero also gets to select a feat. For example, Rawdin the Dwarf can either be Relentless, which gives him a speed boost and prevents him taking damage for the rest of the round, or else he can go for Shield Bash, which pushes all adjacent monsters 1 square away, breaking up swarms of enemies and making it easier for the heroes to navigate cramped spaces. The Wizard Danor also gets 2 sets of spells. Spells are all single use, like in some other games, Personally, I feel like having 3 spell decks is a bit of an illusion of choice. The pyromancy spells are incredibly powerful attacking spells, and the hydromancy spells include healing and crowd control. I can't see I would ever pick the petty magic spells, but at least that option is there. One other minor note about these spell cards, they don't have unique artwork. They just have pictures of a spellbook indicating which group of spells that card comes from. I really would have liked cool art depicting the spell's effects. This would also have had a functional benefit, as you could more immediately tell which spell is which without having to parse the text. Each character then gets a heart token to set their health to max, a revive token, more on those later, and a miniature. The miniatures are really nicely designed. Rawdin the Dwarf in particular looks fantastic, but unfortunately some are quite dynamically posed, which causes issues. Consider Olaf here. He is swinging his axe like a real badass. But look how small the spaces on the map tiles are. He is overhanging so much you can't easily put a miniature on the space next to him. To make things worse, facing in this game is important, so you can't just jiggle the miniatures around until they fit. And his pose doesn't even make it clear which way Olaf is facing anyway. A little embossed arrow on the base would have gone a long way. While the heroes are getting organised, the Overlord refers to the quest book for the current adventure, which in the retail box is the Trial of Tyranny. They will set up the map tiles based on the diagram in the quest book, but they will only lay out monsters, doors and terrain for the room or corridor in which the heroes begin. The heroes then place their characters on the designated starting spaces, and we're off. In the first mission, the heroes will be immediately confronted by... Get used to this. 90% of this game involves fighting... Earlier in the review, I praised Mantic for how much variety they squeezed out of the 18 enemy miniatures in the box. Nevertheless, the game does suffer from a degree of repetition here. By the end of the third quest, you will have seen all but one of the regular enemies, and that last enemy type only appears in 2 quests much later in the campaign. There are 2 bosses to meet along the way as well, but they are stronger versions of enemies you will have already met. And with all the enemies being undead, visually it starts to look a bit samey. You aren't kicking down doors to find skeletons, goblins, ogres, knights and wizards. It's always a skeleton, or 2 skeletons, or a couple of zombies, or some skeletons with some zombies, or zombies in armour, or short zombies. You don't even get to meet a necromancer. I do love the idea of a themed dungeon, of meeting enemies that all feel like they belong together. It's one of the things I think games like Advanced Hero Quest does well, and Dungeon Saga does it well too. But it's hard to maintain enthusiasm for the quest when each room you enter feels much the same as the last. And I know, if you have the Legendary Edition, or once you get into expansions, you do gain access to different monster types, which does obviously mitigate this complaint. But back to our game. The heroes are immediately thrown into a combat situation, but they get to activate first. The heroes can choose to activate in any order they wish, which adds a degree of tactical flexibility to proceedings. An activation comprises 1 movement and 1 action in any order. Actions are fighting, shooting, casting a spell, using a feat, which often then allows for a more powerful fighting, shooting or spellcasting action, exploring, passing an item to an adjacent hero, or reviving yourself after taking a beating. Movement involves moving a number of spaces up to your movement value. You can move diagonally and through other heroes, but not furniture, and if you move out of a space adjacent to an enemy, they get to make a free attack of opportunity on you. Opening a door costs 1 movement point, and when you do open a door, the Overlord immediately populates the room or corridor beyond, following the instructions in the quest book. In addition to the monsters, rooms and corridors may contain treasure chests, furniture, either low furniture that blocks movement or high furniture that blocks movement and line of sight, rubble that also blocks movement and line of sight, portals that let you zap around the board, enemy spawn points, and, weirdly, trap tokens. I really don't like the trap system in this game. During setup, the Overlord will randomly draw a number of tokens that may represent traps, and at certain points in the dungeon, they are allowed to place those tokens on the board. The tokens are placed as soon as that area of the dungeon is revealed, so they are immediately visible. Heroes will know a room or corridor is trapped without needing to search it. And if a hero subsequently steps on a trap token or any space the arrow on the trap token is pointing at, the token is flipped over. If it's got a little picture of a monster on it, the trap was a fake, and the hero can continue. If it's got a picture of a trap, you roll a d6 and consult a trap table to see what kind of trap you have triggered. The hero then has 1 chance to evade the trap, and if they fail, regardless of the nature of the trap, they take 1 wound. And yeah, I just don't like it. For a start, I don't like that the traps are visible and yet there is nothing heroes can do about them. If they want to get past a trap, they have to activate it, and because the trap type is rolled randomly on a table, there is no way of knowing what kind of trap it is or which hero is best prepared to face it. Heroes effectively bumble through the dungeon, purposefully activating traps with their faces. Furthermore, because traps are random, they don't add any sense of narrative. You aren't going to find a part of the dungeon where the ceiling is weak, causing frequent rockfalls, for example. Finally, I just don't think the traps make a lot of thematic sense. For example, if you trigger a gas trap, you have to roll equal to or less than your armor rating to avoid damage, but if you spring a poison dart trap, you face a 3 dice fight attack that you can defend against as if it was a monster. Also, this is a super picky point, the art on the trap tokens depicts a pit trap, but there are no pit traps in the game. Having said all that, the traps working the way they do does have an obvious benefit. You will always know exactly which spaces on the board will activate a trap, which facilitates solo and purely cooperative play. I know that's going to be a big plus point for some gamers. At the end of their movement, the hero should be positioned to face a specific direction. This is important because all models have a front arc, that's the 3 spaces in front of them and the space on either side of them, and then a rear arc comprising the 3 spaces immediately behind them. Heroes can attack stuff and open doors in their front arc, and are penalised if they are attacked by monsters in their rear arc, so they do need to be careful how they position themselves to reduce the risk of being ambushed. Naturally, you are going to end up fighting the ghastly undead minions that shamble through the dungeon. This, I feel, is the most interesting part of the game, which is just as well because you will do more combat than anything else. Combat uses regular d6 and it's a cool little system. The attacker and defender both roll dice equal to their melee stat. Any of the attacker's dice that are equal to or less than the defender's armor rating are discarded immediately. The rest are laid out in order from highest to lowest. The defender then lays out their dice from highest to lowest, and paired dice are compared. The defender will take 1 hit for each dice the attacker rolled that is greater than the paired defense dice, and for each dice the attacker rolled that was unopposed. For example, Olaf rolls 5 attack dice against a skeleton with a melee value of 2 and an armor class of 2. He rolls a 6, 5, 3, 2 and 1. The 2 and the 1 are discarded because they were not strong enough to exceed the skeleton's armor, meaning Olaf has scored 3 potential hits. The skeleton rolls 2 melee dice, scoring a 6 and a 4. These are paired against the attacking dice. The 2 6s cancel out, but Olaf's 5 is higher than the skeleton's second dice of 4, and that scores a hit. Olaf's 3 is unopposed, so scores a second hit. If the total number of hits is greater than a regular enemy's damage target value, they are destroyed. If the total number of hits is less than the damage target value, the monster takes no damage. In our example, the skeleton has a damage target of 2, so would be destroyed. However, bosses and heroes have health trackers. If they take any damage, regardless of how many hits get through, the health tracker is decreased by just 1 step. I like this damage system because it means you don't have to worry about tracking partial successes on enemies. You kill them or you don't, while tougher enemies and heroes only ever take a maximum of 1 damage at a time, which helps to balance out any lucky or unlucky swings. You aren't going to get completely hosed in 1 round of combat just because you rolled all 1s on your defense. That's the basics of combat, but there are other elements to consider. In addition to having access to various skills, weapons and items to mitigate your dice rolls, it's also possible to gain different advantages based on careful positioning of the combatants. Attack an opponent from the rear and they roll 1 dice less. Outnumber an opponent, meaning they are in the front arc of you and at least one of your buddies, and they also roll 1 dice less. No combatant can ever roll less than 2 dice, so if it isn't possible to lower the number of dice they roll, you instead modify their armor value. For example, skeletons only roll 2 combat dice, so if you outnumber them they still roll 2 combat dice, but their armor value is reduced from 2 to 1. Armor can never be reduced below 1, so there does come a point where no amount of clever positional play is going to improve your chances. Shooting is much the same, except you roll dice equal to your ranged attack value, while your opponent still rolls dice equal to their combat value. You roll 1 dice less if you are shooting at a target that is hiding behind low furniture, and they roll 1 dice less if you are shooting them in the back. If you cast a spell, you refer to the text on the spell card. If it's an attacking spell, you roll the number of dice specified on the card, while your target rolls dice equal to their combat. And that's that. If you aren't using your action to punch, shoot, or set fire to something, are you even a hero? But also, you have a few other things you can do on your turn, most commonly, exploring. This is a nice streamlined system, but also one that I have found to be more than a little irksome in play. Heroes can search when there are no monsters in the same room or no monsters visible in corridors. When they do, the Overlord refers to the quest map. If there is a secret passageway, the Overlord places it on the map and reveals anything in the room or corridor beyond it. Then the hero player rolls a dice, and on the result of a 1, marauding monsters appear. If the heroes search a room or corridor that doesn't contain a secret passageway, or they search an area where a secret passageway has already been revealed, they may find treasure instead. If there is treasure listed in the quest book, they receive that treasure. Otherwise, they will draw an exploration card, or 2 exploration cards if they are searching in an area with a treasure chest. And this is where the irk sets in. You are only allowed to search each room or corridor once for treasure, and a lot of the cards in the exploration deck are bad. I mean, a lot of them. There are some cards that say you found nothing, there are some cards that trigger a surprise trap, and there are some cards that spawn marauding monsters. When you spawn a monster, you place it within 5 spaces of the hero searching, and that monster activates immediately. You then roll a dice, and if you roll a 5 or 6, you spawn a second monster at least 5 spaces away, but this one doesn't get to activate. There are 34 exploration cards in the deck, 8 are marauding monsters, 5 are traps, and 2 are nothing, so almost half the deck is bad. And it gets worse. There are 8 potions in the deck and 2 lucky finds that grant you a decent amount of gold, so a total of 10 cards that are just good. The remaining 9 cards award you between 10 and 50 gold pieces, but they also have a risk. If you take the gold, you roll a dice with a 33% chance of something bad happening. This may be losing a point of health from exploding mushroom spores, being stung by a scorpion resulting in a temporary reduction in your combat prowess, or activating a mechanism that lets the Overlord immediately open the closest door, activating one revealed monster. So there's just a lot of bad things that can happen when you explore, and when you search a room with a treasure chest, you are drawing 2 cards at the same time, and you have to play both of them. It's absolutely possible to open a treasure chest and find 4 monsters. At the end of my first game, my daughter, taking on the role of the heroes, was thoroughly disheartened because she had explored every room and she had triggered 5 wandering monsters and 2 traps, amassing just 20 gold coins in the process, not enough to buy anything from the travelling merchants after the quest was over. By the end of our second game, she had scraped together just 100 gold coins. Constantly being penalised for exploring and rarely finding anything interesting does tend to sap a lot of the fun out of a dungeon crawler, and with so many cards generating up to 2 monsters or opening a door that reveals more monsters, plus the chance of up to 2 monsters spawning whenever you find a secret door, a string of bad luck can make the game start to drag as you are constantly hounded by a stream of foes. This problem is only compounded once you get to adventures with enemy spawn points that will spit out extra enemies at the beginning of every turn. It does reach a point where you aren't really exploring anymore, you're just wading through corpses. For me, and I admit this is a personal thing, Dungeon Saga Origins feels like it's lacking in true adventure. There isn't much in the way of set pieces or exciting boss battles. You don't really get a sense that you are uncovering dark domains, dodging deadly traps, uncovering mystical treasure, or writing your own legend. You are just fighting stuff. And of course, when you fight stuff, eventually the worst happens. Heroes in Dungeon Saga Origins have 4 life points. Each time they fail to defend against an attack, they lose 1 life point. If they lose 4, they get knocked down. If they don't have a revive token, they are out of the game. If they do have a revive token, on their next activation they must spend their revive token to stand back up. They restore their wounds to maximum, and their turn ends. In effect, heroes get 2 lives. But here's the really clever bit. When a hero spends a revive token, they flip it over. And what's this? This is called an interrupt token. These belong to the Overlord. So there is a really neat reward system baked into the game for the Overlord. Knock down a hero, forcing them to spend their revive token, and then you get to take that revive token to use as an interruption later on. I guess we should probably talk about the Overlord's role. The Overlord is responsible for 2 things: revealing the dungeon as the heroes explore, and then killing them for having the audacity to explore. Each round, after all the heroes have activated, the Overlord controls all the monsters on the board, moving and fighting with each of them. That's basically it. It's not glamorous, but it's a living. Or, to be more accurate, it's not glamorous, but it's an undead. The biggest problem facing the Overlord is they activate after all the heroes, which means if the heroes are on a hot streak, they can clear out monsters before the Overlord gets a chance to activate them. That's where the interruption tokens come in. After a hero finishes their activation, the Overlord can spend an interruption token to immediately activate one of their minions on the board. This is just enough to keep the heroes on their toes, forcing them to think carefully about which order they should activate in and which monsters they should prioritise as targets. The Overlord starts each game with only 4 interruption tokens, but can earn up to 4 more by defeating heroes. And that is super slick, and really gives the Overlord something to aim for, and a lot more scope for tactical play. I like that a lot. Now, admittedly, the role of the Overlord has been severely cut down in this new iteration of the Dungeon Saga series. In Dwarf King's Quest, the Overlord could raise slain models to fight again, and had a deck of command cards to assist in defeating the heroes. As such, Origins offers a much more streamlined experience, and I would say it's somewhat less interesting as a result. But as the Overlord has to factor in interruptions, facing, skills for monsters, and occasionally spawn points and other special quest rules, there is enough there to ensure an Overlord is never going to be bored. However, if nobody wants to play the Overlord, there is a true solo and co-op mode where the Overlord is automated, and this is a pretty nifty system. Players will find they generally still have to make decisions on behalf of the Overlord, but as much as possible, the Overlord tries to run itself. There is a mood system where the Overlord will become aggressive when the heroes open a door, fight a monster but fail to kill it, or spring a trap. While aggressive, the Overlord may perform interruptions. You draw the bottom card from the exploration deck, and if it has an interrupt symbol, then the Overlord will perform interrupts when able. At the start of every round, or after interrupting and successfully injuring a hero, the Overlord goes back to being passive. To determine what monsters do, there are trait cards. Each monster has a special trait: mindless, vicious, cunning, or swarm. When you activate a monster, you simply look at the action card for their particular trait and perform the first viable action in the list. None of this is particularly sophisticated, but it does work, and it doesn't require an app. Having said that, on the Dungeon Saga Origins website there is a digital Overlord service that will make playing the game easier. It's intended for use when playing solo or co-op, but I find it useful even when I'm playing as the Overlord. It narrates all the in-game fluff text for you, which is very nice. It tracks hero status, gradually reveals the dungeon room by room as you open doors, and will keep track of which rooms you have explored. What it won't do is control the monsters or make any decisions for you. For that, you still have to use the game cards. So it is a useful tool, but I think people who have used the HeroQuest app will find the digital Overlord oversimplified. Which I guess leads us to the elephant in the room. I sort of feel bad for Dungeon Saga Origins, because it is a good game. It does a lot of stuff right. But HeroQuest exists. Now don't get me wrong, there are reasons to recommend Dungeon Saga over HeroQuest. Lots of reasons. I think the miniatures, while being all grey, are better than HeroQuest's. I would say they are excellent for pre-assembled board game pieces, and they have a good amount of detail. Combat is more engaging. The opposed dice rolling with regular 6-sided dice is really neat, and once you get to grips with it, very quick to work out. Positional play is important. You have to think about your facing, defending yourself from flank attacks, avoiding attacks of opportunity as you move around, using your skills, and gaining advantages for outnumbering your opponent. The wide corridors and permissible diagonal attacks also mean you get less bottlenecking, which is essential considering how much fighting you do. There is a much stronger sense of character progression here. Collecting experience points to cash in for powerful one-use abilities gives you something to work towards without leading to overpowered heroes that can steamroll any foes. And I like how you don't always have access to the equipment you want to buy, as it forces you to choose between buying something that isn't really what you wanted, or braving another run in the dungeon with a bulging coin purse. There is a full solo and co-op mode which works with just a few pages of extra rules and a handful of cards, no app required. Using the map tiles is an excellent happy medium between HeroQuest's static board and the single room and corridor tiles of a game like Shadows of Brimstone or Cursed City. You get lots of variability without constantly rummaging around for the right tile or worrying your board might end up hanging over the edge of the table. In fact, any given adventure is fairly compact, using just 2 or 3 map tiles, and there is very little bloat, very few cards and tokens to track, and no need to make notes with pen and paper. So overall, it doesn't require a lot of table space, or shelf space for that matter. You also get a nicely themed adventure. If you like knocking in these skulls of the undead, there is plenty of that here, with a decent variety of foes, including the larger undead trolls and 2 different bosses. It's also really nice to see undead versions of other fantasy races. Having a couple of undead trolls and dwarves kicking about the place just reminds you it isn't always human skeletons that heed the necromancer's call. And if you want to delve into expansions, each of those gives you a brand new themed adventure with a host of thematically relevant foes. You can leave the undead behind and start beating up goblins instead. If Hero Quest was just a musty old game from the 80s, no longer in production, Dungeon Saga is an easy recommendation. It's a modernised version of that game that still does the same job of distilling the essence of a true dungeon crawler into a compact and accessible package. But Avalon Hill revived Hero Quest, and they have done more than simply re-release it with a new lick of paint. They have gradually introduced more advanced rules, more storytelling, more role-playing, new characters like the monk and the rogue with unique and inventive playstyles, hosts of new enemies with abilities that give the heroes more to think about, and a companion app that runs the dungeon for you so you can play solo or purely cooperatively in a way that Dungeon Saga's admittedly clever AI cards struggle to compete with. Ultimately, it starts to make Dungeon Saga feel like it's trying to update a game that has already updated itself. And I do worry that Dungeon Saga is still standing in Hero Quest's shadow, which is a real shame because the game is fun. And I can genuinely look at Dungeon Saga and see why someone would prefer it. It is so slick and it's hard to dislike it. Despite any complaints I've raised in this review, I have still enjoyed every game of it I've played. I do think this is a very tidy redesign of Dwarf King's Quest, and the game has definitely earned its place and deserves its fans. Dungeon Saga Origins could be a great choice for anybody who wants a streamlined, compact, accessible dungeon crawler that supports solo play without having to rely on an app. And if you have ever played Hero Quest and thought it was okay but a bit lacking, if you thought it needed a bit more of a tactical edge, or if you hated it but you are still looking for a truly family-friendly dungeon romp that anyone can learn to play in minutes, Dungeon Saga Origins is definitely worth checking out. And that is it from me for now. All that's left to do is to thank Mantic Games for sending this copy of Dungeon Saga Origins for review, and to thank you for watching. If you like the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really like the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.